August 1945, Yokohama Harbor. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and smoke. Japan had surrendered, yet the silence that followed was more unbearable than the thunder of war. On the cracked concrete beside the port, rows of women stood still, former officers of the Imperial Japanese Army. Their uniforms were torn, their insignia faded, their faces hollowed by hunger and disbelief. A convoy of American trucks rolled to a stop. The sound of engines quieted. From the back stepped women in crisp khaki, members of the American Red Cross and the Women's Army Corps. They carried boxes, not weapons. Inside them, fabric, dresses, coats, shoes, symbols of a life untouched by war. No words were spoken at first. The Japanese women bowed stiffly, unsure whether to meet their eyes. Then one American woman approached, holding out a folded dress. The officer hesitated, then took it. Her hands trembled, and when she realized what it meant, mercy, not victory, she began to cry. Those tears marked something greater than surrender. They marked the first fragile moment of peace. Before the tears, before the surrender, there was duty. For over a decade, Japan had been preparing its people, men, women, and even children, for a war that promised honor or death. By the late 1930s, as the empire expanded across Asia, the government's propaganda machine wove a powerful message. Every Japanese soul was a soldier of the emperor. Men carried rifles. Women carried responsibility. Under this ideology, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere demanded total commitment. Women were urged to serve as nurses, clerks, and communication officers, supporting the Imperial Army in every way short of combat. Many joined the Women's Volunteer Corps or became military nurses, often stationed in China, Burma, or the Pacific Islands. For the first time in Japanese history, women held ranks, wore uniforms, and swore oaths to the emperor. Yet beneath the surface, their service was steeped in sacrifice. Discipline was absolute and compassion was rationed. They were trained to suppress emotion, to embody loyalty and silence. The imperial ideology portrayed them as guardians of purity and honor. A female officer's uniform symbolized both pride and burden. The white armband or khaki jacket did not just signify rank. It was a visible sign of devotion to a dying empire. By 1944, as Allied bombers darkened Japan's skies, many of these women were relocated to the home islands. They assisted in hospitals overflowing with the wounded from Saipan and Okinawa. They cared for men with missing limbs, burned faces, or shattered minds, soldiers still whispering Tenoheika Banzai as they died. But as the tide of war turned, the very structure that gave these women identity began to collapse. Factories stopped, food vanished, Tokyo was burning. Civilians slept in shelters beneath the ruins of their cities. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the illusion of invincibility ended. The emperor's voice, broadcast over the radio on August 15, 1945, spoke words no Japanese subject had ever heard, a tone of surrender. In that moment, silence swept across the nation. For the women of the Imperial Army, the meaning of that silence was unbearable. Their world, built on obedience, hierarchy, and national pride, had dissolved overnight. The officers removed their caps, folded their flags, and wept in private. Many burned their uniforms to avoid shame or arrest. Others hid them away as relics of a lost cause. Yet among them were those who could not flee or return home. Military nurses, secretaries, and auxiliary officers were stranded in cities now occupied by foreign troops. They became symbols of a defeated system, surviving between loyalty to the emperor and submission to the conqueror. And as the U.S. occupation began, they found themselves facing not soldiers, but women. The American Red Cross, the Women's Army Corps, and the Army Nurse Corps entered Japan as part of the occupation's humanitarian wing, bringing food, medicine, and clothing. What they found was not an army, but a nation starving, humbled, and broken. It was in this setting, amid hunger, rubble, and disbelief, that the first encounters between American and Japanese women took place. The Japanese female officers, once symbols of national strength, now stood in line for food and shelter. Their uniforms were tattered, their eyes downcast. And on the other side stood American women, clean, confident, and calm, carrying boxes of clothes and medicine. To the Japanese, this was not just aid. It was humiliation mixed with grace. To the Americans, it was not conquest. It was duty to humanity. This collision of pride and compassion between defeated officers and victorious nurses would soon create one of the most emotional scenes of post-war Japan. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the world changed overnight. The imperial hierarchy that had ruled for centuries was shattered. For the first time, Japan was not master of its destiny. It was a defeated nation under foreign control. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, landed in Japan to oversee the occupation. His mission was clear: to demilitarize, democratize, and rebuild. But for millions of ordinary Japanese, the arrival of the Americans was terrifying. Rumors spread that U.S. troops would exact revenge, that women would be violated, and the emperor might be executed. Yet what arrived on Japanese shores was something unexpected: a different kind of army. Among the American personnel disembarking in Tokyo and Yokohama were not only soldiers and officers, but women, nurses, Red Cross volunteers, clerks, and humanitarian workers. They came dressed in neat khaki uniforms, carrying typewriters, bandages, and sewing kits instead of rifles. They were trained to heal, not to destroy. These women represented something Japan had not seen in years: freedom, equality, and self-assurance. While Japanese women had been raised in submission, trained to bow and obey, American women walked with quiet confidence. Their very presence challenged the deep-rooted ideas of femininity and status within Japanese culture. In the weeks following surrender, chaos reigned. Cities were heaps of ash. Food was scarce, black markets thrived, and epidemics spread in the ruins. Millions of soldiers and civilians returned from the colonies, exhausted, wounded, or traumatized. Among them were female officers of the Imperial Army, now stripped of authority, wandering in search of work, food, and meaning. Many found temporary shelter in abandoned hospitals or makeshift camps near the ports: Yokohama, Osaka, Nagoya. Their uniforms were now symbols of shame, yet they had no other clothes. Some tore off insignias and stitched their coats to hide rank. Others wore the same garments day after day, their once proud khaki stained by sweat and soot. It was there that American relief missions began to arrive, under the joint operations of the Red Cross and occupation forces. They distributed food, blankets, and clothing to civilians. Most of the volunteers were women who had served in field hospitals across the Pacific, hardened by war, but guided by compassion. They encountered women unlike any they had ever seen, disciplined, silent, and broken. The Japanese officers still bowed deeply, refusing to meet their gaze. Many had never spoken to a foreign woman before, much less an enemy. The Americans saw malnutrition, illness, and despair. The Japanese saw a mirror of everything they had been taught to hate, yet could no longer resist admiring. Reports from the occupation archives describe these early encounters as tense but transformative. In one 1946 letter, a Red Cross nurse wrote, "They stood so still as if carved from grief. When we gave them the first garments, their faces changed. Confusion, then disbelief. One began to cry quietly, covering her face with her sleeve. The others followed. For the Americans, it was an act of kindness. For the Japanese women, it was something deeper, a shattering of identity. The empire had fallen. The emperor's command no longer bound them. Yet in that moment, when strangers offered them clean clothes, clothes meant for living, not for serving, they realized what peace could mean. The clothes were simple: cotton dresses, shoes, coats, and ribbons. But to those who received them, they symbolized freedom, from hunger, from fear, from the shadow of the flag they once served. From these quiet exchanges grew a bridge between two worlds. Over the following months, American women trained Japanese nurses, teachers, and social workers. Together, they rebuilt hospitals and schools. The uniform was replaced by the dress and the march by the handshake. It was not victory that transformed Japan's women. It was compassion. And so, in those first months of occupation, the story of tears and new clothes became more than an anecdote. It became a symbol of how dignity could be restored not by power, but by mercy. The emotional, political, and cultural dimensions of that moment form the heart of this documentary's next chapter. The human angle history often remembers wars through generals, battles and treaties, but its truest reflections are found in faces. In the weeks following Japan's surrender, those faces were mostly hollow-eyed, silent, and weary. Among them, the faces of female Japanese officers carried a distinct kind of pain, the pain of defeated purpose. For years, they had served with devotion, tending the wounded and coding military dispatches, or leading medical units in China and the Pacific. They believed their sacrifice honored the emperor and protected their homeland. But now that purpose had dissolved into ash. The women who once wore starched uniforms now found themselves queuing for rations beside civilians. Many hid their insignia or removed buttons to avoid recognition. They slept in overcrowded shelters, clutching the remnants of their service coats. Hunger, disease, and humiliation became daily battles. So when American relief convoys arrived, bringing food and clothing, the gesture reached deeper than material aid. It pierced through layers of pride, grief, and silence. For the Japanese, accepting help meant accepting defeat. Yet for those who had lost everything, even hope, it also meant survival. Witnesses recalled the moment vividly. A group of Red Cross nurses unloading boxes, calling softly for the women to step forward. A few hesitated, trembling. Then one officer, her uniform torn at the sleeve, stepped out of the line. The American woman smiled gently and held out a dress. The Japanese officer took it, bowed, and turned away, but her shoulders shook as she wept. That single act, repeated hundreds of times in refugee centers across Japan, revealed something extraordinary. The war had stripped away nations, flags, and orders, leaving only human beings vulnerable and equal. The gender angle before the war, Japan's expectations of women were rigid and unyielding. They were to serve as obedient daughters, wives, and mothers, the moral foundation of the nation. The phrase Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, defined womanhood. The war twisted that image. Under the empire's mobilization, women became laborers, nurses, and auxiliary soldiers. They were trained to endure pain, to suppress softness, to embody silent loyalty. Femininity was reshaped into patriotism. When defeat came, it was not only the men who faced identity collapse, it was also the women who had lived as symbols of the emperor's strength. They were no longer heroines. They were remnants of a lost order, and so, when American women, confident, practical, independent, arrived in occupied Japan, they represented a kind of liberation that few could yet understand. These American women were not defined by family or nation in the same way. They worked, led, and spoke openly. They looked Japanese officers in the eye, something unthinkable in the rigid hierarchy of Imperial Japan. To Japanese women, this was both unsettling and fascinating. For the first time, they saw women commanding respect without submission, power without arrogance. The cultural shock was immense. When those American women handed them clothes, the gesture symbolized more than kindness. It was a glimpse into a different version of womanhood. A version unchained from the militarism that had defined their lives. As one post-war Japanese nurse later wrote in her diary, they smiled as equals. They did not pity us. They shared their strength, and it frightened me, because I realized how weak obedience had made us. The new garments, soft cotton instead of starched khaki, became metaphors for change. Each thread carried the promise of a new identity, one not bound by war or hierarchy. The cultural angle in Japan, clothing had always been a language of its own. From the elegance of the kimono to the austerity of the uniform, what one wore reflected one's duty and place in society. During the war, uniforms were sacred, symbols of honor, service, and sacrifice. To wear the uniform was to wear the emperor's trust. To lose it was to lose one's self. When the American women brought new clothes, dresses, skirts, coats, they unknowingly challenged that cultural symbolism. These garments were not assigned by rank or duty. They were chosen for comfort and humanity. For the Japanese women receiving them, it was both liberation and shock. Their uniforms had been armor. Now they were being given garments that suggested softness, individuality, and peace. Photographs from the early occupation show Japanese women in ill-fitting Western dresses, their posture still rigid, eyes uncertain. Some wore their new clothes over old uniforms, unable yet to let go. Over time, the simple act of wearing civilian clothing became revolutionary. It marked the end of militarism in daily life and the rebirth of civilian identity. For the Americans, clothing was a tool of restoration. For the Japanese, it was the first tangible symbol of transformation. What began as charity quietly became cultural rebirth, one folded dress at a time. As the cultural lines blurred, deeper forces began to shape what this moment meant politically, emotionally, and morally for both nations. The political angle, every gesture in post-war Japan carried a political echo. When American women handed new clothes to Japanese officers, it was not only an act of kindness, it was also a demonstration of power. The power to rebuild, the power to forgive. The U.S. occupation under General MacArthur was unlike any previous conquest in modern history. It combined military control with cultural transformation. The goal was not to punish Japan, but to reshape it, from a militant empire into a democratic, peaceful state. While the Allied soldiers disarmed the Japanese army, American women began a quieter campaign, the Reformation of Hearts. Through the Red Cross, the WWII, and Women's Army Corps, they introduced hygiene training, literacy programs, and community rebuilding projects. Their approach blended practical aid with moral influence. To MacArthur, this human side of occupation was essential. He famously declared, "Build the women and you build the nation." American women, in this sense, became unofficial ambassadors of democracy. Their compassion was strategy, a softer psychological weapon that replaced bullets with trust. The Japanese government, under occupation oversight, began to reform its legal and social codes. The new Constitution of 1947 enshrined equality between men and women, an unthinkable concept under the old regime. The image of American women helping Japanese officers circulated quietly in local publications and Allied reports. It was proof that the occupation was not simply a victory parade but a moral mission. The same hand that once dropped bombs now extended a gesture of mercy. This political message, that the enemy could become a partner, became the foundation of Japan's recovery and its enduring alliance with the United States. The emotional angle, but beyond politics, the moment was deeply human. Emotion transcended language. Eyewitnesses described the silence that often followed these exchanges. The American women spoke gently, sometimes through interpreters, but more often through expression. Smiles, nods, a touch on the shoulder, universal gestures of empathy. The Japanese officers, trained to suppress feeling, found themselves overwhelmed. Some bowed so deeply their foreheads touched the ground. Others turned away, unable to contain their tears. For years, they had lived under a system that glorified sacrifice and despised vulnerability. To cry in uniform was shameful, but now tears were no longer signs of weakness, and they were signs of release. The emotional current flowed both ways. Many American women had lost brothers or husbands in the Pacific War, yet here they were, comforting the women of their enemies. For them, compassion was a way to heal their own scars. Letters from U.S. volunteers revealed that these encounters changed them too. One Red Cross nurse wrote in 1946, "I thought I would hate them, but I saw mothers, sisters, and daughters who had lost as much as we did. We cried together without words. Those tears erased distance. They transformed strangers into witnesses of each other's humanity. Over time, the emotional thaw spread through communities. Japanese women began volunteering with American nurses, learning to care for children and the elderly. They rebuilt hospitals and orphanages side by side. In the midst of ruins, the bond of shared womanhood became a quiet form of peacebuilding, invisible to headlines but powerful in effect. The moral angle war dehumanizes. It turns faces into enemies and uniforms into targets. Yet in peace, morality must return, not through speeches, but through simple acts. The moment when a Japanese officer accepted a new dress from an American nurse was small, almost insignificant in the grand scale of history, but morally it was monumental. It was the first acknowledgement that kindness could exist between conqueror and conquered. It was the first proof that forgiveness could take physical form. A gesture, a smile, a folded piece of fabric. For centuries, Japan's moral framework had been built upon honor and obedience. Defeat shattered that framework. The new morality that emerged from the ashes was shaped not by ideology, but by empathy. In Western philosophy, mercy is a virtue. In Japanese tradition, it is jin, human-heartedness. In that moment, jin returned to a nation that had forgotten it through years of war. The American women, too, found meaning in these encounters. They realized that victory was hollow if it did not include compassion. Their work was not about dominance, but about restoring dignity, to others and to themselves. This moral exchange laid the foundation for Japan's transformation from militarism to pacifism. The post-war Constitution's Article 9 renouncing war was more than a political clause. It was a reflection of a society learning to value compassion over conquest. The tears of those women, American and Japanese alike, symbolized a shared understanding that peace begins when empathy replaces pride. As months passed, those first small acts began to ripple outward, into communities, into institutions, into the very heart of a nation learning to live again. The story now moves toward its climax, the day when that single act of compassion unfolded in full view, forever altering the perception of victory and defeat. Yokohama, late autumn 1945. The city was gray and hollowed by war. Skeletons of buildings stood against the pale sky like charred bones. The port smelled of ash and seaweed, a place where silence had replaced sirens. Along the docks, the wind tugged at fragments of paper and cloth, remnants of a world that no longer existed. Inside a requisitioned warehouse near the harbor, an improvised relief station had been set up by the American Red Cross and the U.S. Army's Women's Corps. Wooden tables, rough crates, and tin lamps filled the dim space. Outside, hundreds of Japanese civilians lined up, men, women, and children, waiting for rations and clothing. Among them stood a small group apart from the rest. Their posture was upright, their faces pale but composed. They were former officers of the Imperial Japanese Women's Army Corps, now stripped of their ranks. Their khaki uniforms were worn to threads. Some still bore faded armbands. Others had tried to disguise the insignia with scraps of cloth. They stood in silence, not speaking even among themselves. Their training had taught them to endure without complaint, to face defeat with composure. Yet behind that discipline lay exhaustion so deep it hollowed their eyes. A young American woman, Lieutenant Helen Brooks, a 26-year-old Army nurse from Ohio, walked out from the warehouse carrying a bundle of folded garments. She had spent months tending to prisoners and refugees across the Pacific. War had hardened her hands but not her heart. She paused before the line of Japanese women, unsure how to begin. Her interpreter, a Japanese-American volunteer named Aiko Tanaka, whispered softly, "They are former officers. Be gentle." Brooks nodded, then stepped closer. She smiled faintly, not out of pity but respect. The first officer stepped forward. Her uniform hung loosely, sleeves frayed, boots worn through. She was perhaps 30, though the war had aged her. Brooks extended her hand and offered a folded gray dress, simple cotton, plain buttons, the kind worn by American women in everyday life. For a moment, the Japanese officer did not move. Her fingers twitched at her side. Accepting charity from the enemy felt unbearable. Yet hunger and cold gnawed at her resolve. Slowly she reached out. Their hands touched, one gloved, one bare. Something changed in the air. The officer's breath caught. Her lips trembled. She bowed deeply, the motion slow and deliberate. Then, to everyone's surprise and even her own, tears fell. Not loud sobs, but silent tears that left tracks down her dust-streaked face. Behind her, others began to weep as well. Decades of discipline cracked in an instant. Brooks hesitated, then placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable only months before. The contact was brief, but it carried the weight of two nations' histories. Inside the warehouse, the other American women continued their work, sorting clothes, distributing shoes, wrapping blankets around children. Yet as the scene at the entrance unfolded, a hush fell. Everyone sensed its gravity. A photographer from the Occupation Press Corps standing nearby quietly raised his camera. He captured the image, a young American nurse handing a dress to a tearful Japanese officer. That photograph, later circulated in Allied reports, would become one of the quiet symbols of post-war compassion, the moment mercy replaced conquest. But in that instant, there were no cameras in the minds of those who lived it. only the fragile connection between two women, both scarred by war in different ways. The officer later wrote in a private diary, recovered decades later. When she gave me the dress, I felt the weight of defeat. Yet in her eyes there was no hatred. I realized we had both suffered, and for the first time I wished for peace, not victory. As more women came forward, the Americans handed out coats, scarves, and shoes. Each exchange carried an invisible dialogue. Shame met with empathy, loss met with understanding. The warehouse became a chapel of silence, broken only by soft weeping and the rustle of cloth. Outside, the winter wind rose from the bay, sweeping through the broken streets of Yokohama. The sound of the sea blended with the murmur of distant voices, and for the first time in years those voices carried no command, no salute, no cry of defiance. Only gratitude. That afternoon, dozens of former officers left the station wearing their new clothes. The uniforms that had once bound them to the Empire were folded away, tucked beneath their arms or left behind on the cold floor. In the months ahead, many of those women would begin working as nurses, teachers, or volunteers under the American administration, but it was here, in that warehouse with that single exchange, that their transformation began. The surrender had ended the war, but that moment began the peace. What came next deepened this transformation, not just for those women, but for an entire nation learning to redefine itself under the eyes of its former enemy. For weeks after that day at the Yokohama relief station, similar scenes unfolded across Japan. In Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, and smaller towns like Fukuoka and Sendai, American women arrived in jeeps and supply trucks, carrying parcels wrapped in brown paper and cloth. Inside those bundles were not weapons or rations, but dresses, shoes, and scarves, simple items of everyday life. Yet each carried immense emotional weight. Every time a box opened, the same silence filled the air. That hesitant pause between former enemies, bridged only by the universal language of compassion. The Japanese women, often barefoot and exhausted, lined up with quiet dignity. They bowed deeply as they received their garments. Some held them tightly against their chest as if embracing a piece of hope. For the Americans, the act was equally profound. They had come from a land of abundance where victory meant parades and medals. But here, standing amid rubble, they understood that victory meant something entirely different. Not dominance, but renewal. Letters home from American volunteers spoke of a changed understanding of peace. "I thought I was coming to help rebuild a country," wrote Corporal Ruth Dillard, a Women's Army Corps clerk stationed in Tokyo. "But instead I saw people rebuilding their souls. I never imagined an enemy could look so much like myself." In hospitals, American nurses worked alongside former Imperial Army nurses, teaching medical hygiene, sharing scarce supplies. The language barrier remained, yet gestures carried meaning: a nod, a smile, a shared bandage. The women who had once followed orders from opposite sides now moved in sync to save lives. It was a quiet revolution, one that no army could enforce, and no treaty could guarantee. The emotional turning point also became a cultural awakening. The uniforms that had once symbolized Japan's collective identity were replaced by civilian clothing that emphasized individuality. For many Japanese women, the first Western-style dress they received became a treasured possession. It represented more than comfort. It represented freedom. Before the war, Japanese women rarely owned clothing chosen by themselves. Everything, from fabric to color, went and was dictated by family, status, or duty. But these post-war garments, given freely and without command, marked the first act of personal choice. In a symbolic sense, the dress became an emblem of rebirth, a quiet rebellion against years of conformity. American women recognized this transformation even if they could not articulate it fully. One Red Cross volunteer later reflected, "We thought we were giving them clothes, but we were giving them permission to be human again." Photographs from 1946 show groups of Japanese women in mismatched Western clothes, floral dresses with military boots, cardigans over old uniforms, scarves wrapped like improvised kimonos. These images, though awkward, capture the fragile beauty of a nation in transition. No longer soldiers, not yet modern citizens. They were caught between two worlds. And in that in-between space, something new began to grow. Self-awareness aftermath. Section 1. The tears shed that August morning did not remain isolated moments of emotion. They became the quiet foundation of a transformation that would define Japan's post-war soul. In the months following surrender, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, or ESCAP, initiated sweeping reforms. Yet beneath the towering decrees and official mandates, it was the softer influence of human contact that truly changed the nation. The American women stationed across Japan, nurses, Red Cross workers, translators, clerks, became informal ambassadors of modern values. They represented not the conquering power but a different kind of strength, empathy. Japanese women, once confined by strict hierarchies of obedience and silence, began to see alternatives. The simple act of receiving clothing, freely given without condition, carried psychological meaning. For the first time, many experienced an interaction not defined by rank or authority, but by equality. Sociologists later described this period as the human bridge phase of occupation, a time when the personal interactions between women of both nations quietly accomplished what official diplomacy could not. By 1946, as rationing continued and food remained scarce, the relief programs expanded. The American Red Cross, UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and private church missions coordinated shipments of supplies, everything from powdered milk to second-hand shoes. But beyond logistics, something subtler took root. Many former Japanese nurses and clerks volunteered to help distribute these supplies. They worked beside Americans, learning procedures, record-keeping, and even conversational English. These collaborations planted the early seeds of Japan's post-war professional class. Women who had once served as auxiliary officers or field medics now found themselves retrained as civilian nurses, teachers, and administrators. In time, some of them would lead schools, hospitals, and local aid organizations, the first generation of independent Japanese women in a changing society. MacArthur's administration recognized the importance of this transformation. The 1947 Constitution of Japan, largely shaped under SCAP's supervision, included one of the most radical clauses in the world at that time: full legal equality for women. Article 24 declared that marriage shall be based only on the mutual consent of both sexes, and that with regard to choice of spouse, property rights, inheritance, choice of domicile, divorce, and other matters pertaining to marriage and the family, laws shall be enacted from the standpoint of individual dignity. It was not merely a political reform, it was the codification of a moral awakening. The memory of those first post-war encounters between American and Japanese women had demonstrated the possibility of dignity without dominance, and though not every Japanese citizen welcomed the change, many saw it as foreign interference. The cultural momentum had already shifted. On a street in Tokyo in 1948, a journalist captured a striking photograph. A group of young Japanese women walking together, heads held high, wearing a mix of Western skirts and traditional kimonos. Behind them, an American Jeep passes by, but none turn to look. The caption beneath the image read, "The New Japan Walks Forward." That image symbolized a turning point. In just 3 years, the emotional wounds of defeat had begun to transform into a quiet resilience. The former officers who had once stood in tears at Yokohama now found new roles as teachers, midwives, and civic leaders. Some spoke publicly about their wartime experiences, urging others to choose compassion over obedience. They had learned firsthand that mercy was not weakness and it was reconstruction. Yet the process was not without pain. Post-war poverty remained widespread. Black markets thrived. Malnutrition haunted the population for nearly a decade. But the small humanitarian gestures, a dress, a loaf of bread, a shared blanket, continued to ripple through the social fabric, holding despair at bay. American and Japanese women built informal support networks, writing letters, exchanging recipes, even forming friendship circles, small groups dedicated to teaching cultural exchange and domestic skills. Many historians now regard these efforts as the emotional groundwork for what would become Japan's economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s. For when a society begins to rebuild its trust, more especially between former enemies. Progress follows naturally. Those first encounters had shown something profound. The strength of a nation does not lie solely in its armies or its industry, but in its capacity to forgive and to be forgiven. And though the uniforms had been burned and the empires had fallen, what endured were the small acts of humanity that no surrender document could ever record. Aftermath, Section 2. By the early 1950s, Japan was no longer a defeated empire. It was a nation in recovery, cautiously stepping into the modern world. Factories that once built aircraft parts now produce sewing machines and radios. Bombed-out cities began to glow with electric lights again. And in the midst of that rebuilding, women, both Japanese and American, remained the invisible architects of peace. Those same relief centers that once handed out clothing evolved into community halls and women's associations, where locals gathered to discuss childcare, nutrition, and education. The emotional bond born from compassion had become institutionalized, transformed into a framework for cooperation. The Yokohama Women's Friendship Center, founded in 1948, became one of the first cultural bridges between American and Japanese women. Its mission was simple: to provide skills, dignity, and understanding. By 1952, similar organizations had opened in Hiroshima, Osaka, and Sapporo, many founded by women who had personally lived through those first post-war encounters. Within just 7 years, a new generation of Japanese women had risen, educated, confident, and deeply aware of both the cost of obedience and the power of empathy. The United States-Japan Security Treaty of 1951, signed at San Francisco, formally ended the occupation. But long before that, the emotional reconciliation had already begun in those relief warehouses. The treaty may have defined political terms, but it was the compassion between individuals that made it sustainable. When U.S. forces gradually withdrew, American women left behind more than supplies. They left an imprint, a moral memory embedded in Japan's new civic identity. Many Japanese women preserved the garments they had received, repairing them over the years, passing them to daughters and granddaughters. To them, these clothes were sacred relics of kindness in a world that had forgotten mercy. Photographs from this era show contrasts that words can scarcely capture. On one page, an image of an American nurse teaching a group of Japanese girls how to read English, her smile warm but restrained. On the next, a solemn portrait of a former Imperial Army nurse holding her daughter, the child wearing a faded cotton dress marked U.S. Relief 1946. These are not propaganda images. They are portraits of rebirth. The shared experiences of women from both nations began to transcend politics entirely. They became the first true messengers of peace, not through speeches or treaties, but through empathy. The symbolism of new clothing grew deeper with time. In post-war Japanese literature, garments often appeared as metaphors for transformation. Writers like Fumiko Enchi and Aya Koda depicted women shedding the weight of tradition through symbolic acts of renewal, donning Western clothes as statements of personal agency. Even in film, directors such as Yasujiro Ozu captured this subtle revolution. The quiet dignity of women navigating a world that demanded both remembrance and reinvention. Every stitch in those dresses, every fold of donated fabric, became a thread in Japan's moral and cultural reconstruction. By the 1960s, when Japan hosted the Tokyo Olympics, the world witnessed a nation reborn, confident, modern, and peaceful. Yet behind the spectacle of progress lay invisible stories. Those of women who had once stood barefoot at Yokohama Harbor, trembling as strangers handed them symbols of grace. Many of them were still alive then, watching the ceremony on newly affordable television sets, remembering how far their country had come. They knew that what the world saw as Japan's miracle had in truth begun in moments of humility, in tears shed not for defeat, but for rediscovered humanity. For the Americans, too, those encounters left a lasting legacy. The experience of compassion in a conquered land reshaped their understanding of victory. It taught them that democracy, if imposed without empathy, becomes hollow, but if nurtured through respect, it endures. Some of the women who had served in Japan later became advocates for international aid and human rights. Others joined the Peace Corps, citing their post-war experiences as the reason they believed change could begin with one act of kindness. Through them, the lesson of Yokohama traveled far beyond Asia. Time, inevitably, softened the sharp edges of memory. But in museums and archives across Japan, in Tokyo, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima, there remain faded garments, letters, and photographs. They are quiet testaments to a truth that war could not destroy, that empathy is the most powerful weapon ever forged by humanity.